So I am Timandra Harkness. I am chairing this session. Could AI break the productivity impasse, like by getting chairs to the right room on time? Answer clearly yes. We have a great panel, and we have an hour and a half to discuss this. So hopefully we will answer the question by the end of the session. So productivity, UK productivity is obviously recognised to be a continuing problem, and one of the solutions that's offered to this is that we use more technology, in particular AI, which is very much all the rage. So we've got a great panel of people with, I think it's fair to say, a range of views on this. And then, as usual, we'll come out to the audience and get your opinions. I'm going to use the old-fashioned coloured cards technique here. I'm afraid so, yes. So just to tell you, because I may have to use this on you as well. When somebody on the panel or in the audience has a minute left to speak, I will show the yellow card. Have we got that, panel? And when it's time really to shut up and stop speaking, I will use the red card. And as I say, people from the audience, we encourage contributions. Don't have to disguise them as a question. But if you go on for too long, then you will get a red card. Everyone else will see it, and I'll expect you to shut up and sit down. Good. Glad we got that clear. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the panel in the order in which they'll speak. And then I'm going to ask them to speak for 6 or 7 minutes each. And then we will come out and widen the discussion to all of you. So from my far left, as usual, geographically rather than politically, we have Tom Bewick, who is the Visiting Professor of Skills and Workforce Policy at Staffordshire University and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. As usual, I'm not going to give you the entire biography, which is on the website. Next, we are going to hear from Donald Clark, sitting on my immediate left. You may have heard him make a very good contribution in the session this morning about technology. He is a learning tech entrepreneur, an investor. He's fought 40 years in tech. He says in a very charmingly handwritten update to his biog, he's the author of Learning in the Metaverse and the founder of various things. He says it's a book on AI. Learning in the Metaverse, a book on AI. There you go. Next, we're going to hear from Andrew Orlowski. Is he Orlowski or Orlowski?
Orlowski.
It is Orlowski. Good. I had that sudden panic. Have you been saying someone's name wrong all these years?
In polls say it both different ways. You can't get them to agree on anything.
Okay, so apart from polls, it's Andrew Orlowski, who's a writer and a critic, a business columnist, The Daily Telegraph, and has been writing very interestingly on technology for a very long time. And then finally, we're going to hear from Dr. Norman Lewis, who again made a great contribution in this morning's session on technology. He's a visiting research fellow at MCC Brussels and the co-author of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. But really, that's a very tiny fraction of his long career in technology and innovation. And also, he has got a great Substack called What a Piece of Work is Man. So if you like listening to him here, I recommend you go and read that.
Subscribe.
It's like a walking subscribe button. So there you go. So start us off with your 6 to 7 minutes on, is AI going to solve the productivity impasse? Tom.
Thank you, Timandra, and good afternoon, everyone. And I certainly don't want to get red carded by you, Timandra. Perhaps I could toady up to you by saying, actually, I'm going to be buying your book later on today. Not least because, and I hope it's going to be signed, coffee too. Not least because when I saw the title "Technology is Not the Problem," I always think that would make a great headline actually for my 6 or 7 minutes, because that's absolutely the perspective that I'm coming from. Not least as an educationalist, not as with other members of the panel, experts on AI. And really, what I wanted to sort of throw out there is, because it is a complex debate, but I think for me you can boil it down to 3 different perspectives on this question of can AI help us with the productivity impasse. I think in broad terms, what you'll come across are what I would describe as the utopians on this subject. Then there's the technology pessimists, and then there's sort of where I am on this debate, which is the rational optimists. And I'll say something about each of those groups. And I actually think, by the way, we need all 3 of those groups in this debate. I'm not sort of making a normative judgment that one's got better answers than the other ones. But, let's start with the utopians. I mean, in a sense, this idea of creating a society in which essentially technology eradicates the need for physical labor of any kind is not new. You know, Thomas More was writing about this in 1513. In fact, he invented the term utopia. That's where it comes from. Not many people actually would put that very sober post-war or neoclassical economist John Maynard Keynes in the utopian camp. But actually, if you read his 1930 essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, so essentially he's talking about many of us in this room. I'd certainly just about qualify for being a grandchild of that generation. But what Keynes talked about in that 1930 essay was that by 2030, he believes that a combination of compound interest, obviously his great theories on money, but also productivity would result in us having a 3-hour day. And in fact, what Keynes was really concerned about in 1930 was the extent to which that productivity dividend would result actually in us as a species, as human beings, fearing the dread of not really having enough work to go around, and therefore wondering what we would do with our leisure time. And what's interesting, since these groups aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, is then you get into the post-war sort of economists and, you know, what I call the technology pessimists. And actually a very good example of that, I recommend his book, Daniel Susskind, who wrote A World Without Work just a couple of years ago. And his sort of central thesis really is that AI and technology and automation will be so fundamental in terms of its transformation that we need to start thinking now about policies for dealing with that world without work. And like a lot of academics, actually, from Suskind's worldview, his prescription, which I don't agree with, that he arrives at, is that the answer to that world without work is a universal basic income. That's basically where he gets to. And then there's this third group of a sort of rational optimists that take the long view, as I do, which is, first of all, this idea of technological unemployment is not new. You can go right back to, the invention of the stocking frame and William Lee's machine. It had 2,000 moving parts. It was actually first industrial revolution, so it wasn't fully yet part of what we now call the commodity labour market. But, that's where the word Luddites, where this idea of smashing up these machines comes from. And you see it actually throughout the whole post-war literature, and I've just I've got a book coming out. In fact, I'm going to plug my book now. I've got a book coming out next year on skills policy and the future of work, and I've spent far too many hours in the records office at Kew, reviewing actually a lot of the primary source evidence of this issue about technological unemployment. It comes up time and time again, this idea that automation, it was automation in the 50s and 60s, it was the microprocessor in the 70s, and now, AI is just the latest iteration of that. And the thing is, and I'll wrap up now my comments on why I'm a rational optimist, is that it seems to me that with every major economic transition, particularly those that potentially bring in GPTs, these general purpose technologies, 2,600 years ago in the Iron Age, horses were the main mode of transportation for our own bipedal species, and that didn't change, right until the great horseshit crisis in New York and London of 1890, when seriously, planners there worried about what they would do with the equivalent of 4 feet of manure that was coming into these metropolitan areas. Within a decade, the petrol combustion engine steam just before that put an end to that particular crisis, and that's really where I come from in terms of this technology debate. We just don't know. We can't predict the future. We certainly can't predict the jobs. And I'll just end on this final story, because I was an advisor just across the road at the Department for Education in the early 2000s. And I never forget being invited to a seminar in Downing Street called Skills and Lifelong Learning, the Future. And it was in 2002. And it was obviously before Mark Zuckerberg's creation of Facebook. It was before the iTunes iOS platform was invented. And here are all these great economists and others, decision makers, educators have been invited to a meeting with, say, Tony Blair, to discuss what the jobs of the future would be. And we could never have predicted what was just around the corner with social media, with AI. And here we are 20 years on, and 3% of the British labour force relies on or is related to that technology, i.e. jobs in social media, marketing, digital marketing. No one could have anticipated that just 20 years ago. The iOS platform that obviously has an ecosystem of app developers, that employs in Britain today 440,000 people. That's more than we had people working in the coal industry in the 1970s. And that's really my point about, this idea that technology drives unemployment is not a thesis, in my view, you should entertain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good. It's always nice to start with a bit of optimism. Are you going to keep us optimistic, Donald? Off you go.
Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, well, I've worked for 40 years in tech, and the last 10 years exclusively in AI. But I wouldn't call myself a tech utopian. I really hate crypto. Absolutely hate it. I hardly use my smartphone. Nevertheless, in my 40 years, I have never seen anything like this. I've never seen anything like this because most of the most valuable companies on the planet right now are AI companies. And if you think this is going away, think again. And we've been through this before. So we had, in the US, about 1800, you had 75% people worked in agriculture. It's down to 1.2% by 2000, but we've a 500% increase in productivity. Massive shift over 2 centuries, though. This one's going to happen much, much quicker. The same is true in manufacturing, by the way. As manufacturing output goes up, by and large, times 5, you get a fall in the need for labor. It's massively efficient through automation. And the same will happen to white-collar workers, and I know that because it's happening. So I want to be quite evidence-based on my little talk here. The first thing is the research base. So you have to look at the papers. And even as early as 2023, after Gen AI hit the streets, you have the Noy paper from MIT. If I split this room into 2 groups, I give you Gen AI and you not, and you have high-end data analyst skills, high-end cognitive skills, you will win. You'll do it 26% faster. In fact, the Noy paper was 0.8% standard deviation faster, which is amazing. You're much faster. Not only that, your quality will be much higher than these guys. That was 0.4 standard deviation, which is still really significant. Then along came the Mollick paper, sample 700 odd people, high-end consultants, medical people, and so on. Same thing, you split the room down the middle, you get a much faster completion rate over here. Not only that, the quality of output is higher. It's not doing it faster, it's doing it better. And then generally in knowledge workers, the Cambon paper after that shows a general minimum sort of 26.7-ish sort of increase in productivity. But the range here is often 20 to 70%. This is not 1 or 2, 3%, 20 to 70% because it happens in seconds. And you've all had that holy shit moment on when you're using AI and goes, that would have taken me 4 hours. And it just happened in seconds. Now just multiply that. So we have the academic, by the way, the steam engine only gave us, about the 1800s, only gave us about 22% increase in productivity. This is way beyond that. And of course, within a year or so, and it's individuals doing it. We didn't all buy a steam engine, during the Industrial Revolution. But what about the real world? Well, let me give you a really interesting example. One of the most, I think, the greatest single example of productivity in the history of our species took place through AI in this city in 2020. And Dennis Hassabis got a Nobel Prize for this. There are 200 million known proteins. He wrote an algorithm with a team which actually solved that problem, and it's in the free database. You can go and look at this. 200 million. It did take about 1 to 4 years to establish the 3D structure of a protein historically. Okay, so do the maths. That is centuries of saved research. Not only that, all those researchers can concentrate on curing cancer, and indeed they used those protein structures during the COVID period as well. So do you need any more proof? Even just that one example. Centuries of research time saved in productivity. Let's go to the sector level, because the future's here, but it's unevenly distributed. So it's big in tech, it's big in pharma, it's big on SMEs. Small companies use this stuff all the time because they don't want to hire people. They're short of money. And the law is another one, although Timandra's is a situation she doesn't trust it in the law. But again, the research at the sector level, if you look at programmer productivity, which is my game really in the tech world, it is quite astounding what has happened here. The first paper was due in 2024 early here, as a general 4,900 coders, about a 26% increase in productivity. Then you have Amazon coming in, who saved 4,500 developer years in updating their code. If you run a big company, you've got lots of legacy code. Banks have really crap code. You're looking after your money. At some point, you have to upgrade that. It's incredibly expensive, and it takes years. We have in Amazon saving $260 million, and they do it in record time with hardly any code changes, because a lot of it is automated. Okay? So even in the real world, we see example in the very famous paper on the law, where again we split two groups, lawyers plus ChatGPT. You guys absolutely hammer these guys over here in terms of the speed. The speed is remarkable. I don't know if you've ever used a lawyer. It costs you a lot of money, and they're incredibly slow. Now imagine a legal decision that takes seconds, because the interesting thing about this academic paper in the conclusion, it said it was 98.97% faster than a human lawyer. If that's not productivity, I really don't know what is. So I think even in these domain-specific areas, because AI has moved into much more sophisticated systems where the provenance of the data and the information comes back through to you through RAG techniques and all sorts of things that we needn't go into today. Pharma and healthcare is another amazing one. A paper just published, which I really love, by Go, which compared doctors plus normal resources, doctors plus ChatGPT, and a third group, just ChatGPT on clinical decision-making. Now, what shocked people here is everybody, all the academics put this in the foreword of the paper, they thought that the doctor plus ChatGPT would win. ChatGPT on its own trounced the other two. Now, this is interesting. A doctor has about a 5% misdiagnosis rate if you go to your GP. That sounds worse than you say 1 in 20. 1 in 20, okay? Now, if you get, and I think we're getting very close, to ChatGPT or another AI system giving you 1 to 2%, you'd be a fool to go to your doctor, especially if you're an older man where the common misdiagnosis is reflux versus heart problems, because you can die. So I think it's a qualitative shift in terms of productivity as well. And of course, we have things like radiology, pathology, which are already being sort of supercharged with this stuff. So really just to end on one big thing here, the thing that's amazed me about this technology is its ubiquity. Because actually a funny thing's happening. Everybody's using it on the sly. This is actually not like the steam engine. If you look at the big data sets now that are coming back, everybody's using it, no matter what their age, but not institutions. University faculty, your bosses are all holding the fort because their jobs are at risk here. Ask anybody who's 14 in a school. Ask the people at Harvard, where the recent survey was 95% of students using ChatGPT. But the institutions don't want to come near it. Okay, so this is anyone, anywhere, anytime, any subject, any level. If you don't think that's going to increase productivity, I don't know what other arguments you could possibly give to counter that.
Thank you, Arnold. And if only you'd let ChatGPT deliver your talk, you could have been 20% more efficient and finished before you got the red card. Next time, eh? All right, Andrew, are you going to sweep us along this tide of techno-optimism?
Thanks very much. Well, wow, how do you follow that? Thanks everyone to coming when there's always so many concurrently interesting, fascinating panels which go on a battle of ideas. I've had a racking cough and flu this week, so I'm going to have this jousting adversarial relationship with the microphone, and I hope I don't deafen you. Is it possible to enjoy a story too much? I had this thought when the Hezbollah pager attack took place, and I was admiring this on so many levels. the sophistication of it, the social engineering, the pinpointing. But essentially, each of these were targeting a human vulnerability, a vanity, and very often, I think, what Mossad did brilliantly was they bet that the users would not interrogate the technology that was in front of them. And I've got so I took a great guilty pleasure from that. I'm sorry, it's a very bad person to admit it. But I've enjoyed AI, writing about AI enormously. And I think over almost 70 years, artificial intelligence has given us the same kind of insight, a lesson into human gullibility and vulnerability. I just want to say one or two things about productivity, one of which I think is very rarely mentioned, but is critical if we all want to understand how generative AI is going to affect the workplace. To me, there's no puzzle with productivity. It's exactly, in the UK, it looks exactly what we expect it to look at in a country with a large number of poor people, which has shifted the economy from high-value industrial and manufacturing to services. Poland already feels much richer than the UK. It has 33% of its economy is manufacturing. Singapore is often cited as an example. It is a very interesting example. 20% is manufacturing. Britain's now down to 10%. I think with the end of globalization, that's going to change a lot of the stigma of wanting to create an economy which is based on science, which is turned into products, where we export very high value goods. The stuff we're absolutely fantastic at, is a lot of the stigma of that is disappearing, perhaps. Second point about productivity is that it's slightly skewed because economists like to talk about what they can measure. And productivity is, one of the simplest sums that you can measure. I was speaking to a former World Bank economist who is musing on this himself, how remote the profession had become from reality. And he said, well, economists, once they have a data set, they're just really happy to just go off and interrogate the data set. But there's one thing that's been a huge change in the organizations over 25 years. Nobody takes the trouble to measure. And that's the fact that a lot of people are in work, but not actually working. There's been two fantastic books on this in the last 25 years. I'd recommend David Bolshover's The Living Dead, which is a great description of people who only have maybe an hour to work each day. And we are talking the managerial white-collar middle class here. There aren't any working class jobs left where you can loaf around and nobody notices or fires you for it. So since 1997, the amount of jobs with the word manager in them have quadrupled. We have 400,000 people working in HR. That's only slightly less than work in agriculture. We have huge areas, corporate communication, of regulation and compliance, even software development, teams with nothing to do but to reinvent the wheel. Elon Musk has showed that you can be more productive with a tenth of the staff. Now, I think this is. So some sociologists predicted this a while ago, that there would be people who aren't really bright enough to do the hard thinking that you need in an advanced technological society, but are too status conscious to get down and work in services. It's just sort of beneath them. Now, I think that final point is really, really crucial. The productivity figures that we get are kind of meaningless because nobody's measuring the amount of idle time or empty labour that is taking place in larger organisations. And into this world comes essentially a tool for faking it, for fooling your boss that you're busy when you're not busy. And if you doubt me, in May, Microsoft started marketing Copilot on the basis that it was brilliant for deceiving your boss. An ad suggested that you can attend 3 meetings at once, and you can turn 150 pages of text into a 5-minute presentation. Where's the productivity gain in there? The answer is there isn't any. You're just paying an additional fee to Microsoft or Google for that tool. Now, there's fascinating moral discussions beyond this panel discussion to have. What happens when you unleash a tool, which is essentially rewards the diligent and the deceptive employees and punishes the honest and the hard-working employees? What happens in that workplace? But my conclusion here is that sociologically, I'm often asked what's going to happen with AI. And I think this kind of sociological battlefront between managers who are aware of this and do something about it is absolutely critical, because we essentially have two welfare states, right? We have the one that pays benefits that the taxpayer pays for. Then we have the system of corporate welfare, if you like. It's a job creation scheme for the middle class. That's paid for by the consumer. Where does productivity fall out if you give people a tool for faking it, essentially? Now, it all comes down to what the managers want to do. In many large firms, at the end of the year, if there's a budget, they ask for 10 more because it's a status thing to have more employees in your department. Managers who run those kinds of places don't really care that their staff are not productive. Again, generative AI doing this or that doesn't really matter. That is the big picture. I just want to finish with a quote that Mark Benioff said a couple of years ago. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt now that the bubble is bursting. It's a case of how much splatter we're covered with as it bursts. There's no competitive moat for the products. There's no business model for it. I mean, I'd love it. I kind of have it myself running in the background. And it does sort of tickle me that every time I produce silly picture on Twitter, like the lights flicker down the eastern seaboard of the United States as the lights go out. There's no business model. It's nice, but most of it is going to be shaken out. And is it going to take down the economy? Most of the rise in equities is entirely down to AI. Once the commercialities which are now being seen come in, how much does it affect the rest of the system? But Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, said on Thursday, it's in a tweet, he said, well, the co-pilot trials have come in now, and this is what I've been hearing all year. It's spilling data everywhere. There's absolutely no... If I've got 20 seconds, I'll find the quote because it's so good. Mark Benioff, it's disappointing. It doesn't work. It doesn't deliver any level of accuracy. And this is not an academic study, by the way. This is what we're all being told. Spilling data everywhere, and customers are left to clean up the mess. And then they're told to build their own LLMs. Yeah, I'm finding that a lot. There's a huge fallout from this. It's not the AI that we were promised. Once we start go down from abstract discussions of what AI could do down to what the one in front of us actually does do, I think we hit with an enormous reality check. And I haven't even begun to mention the externalities of open information systems on the web being poisoned, the cleanup costs, and so on. So I hope I'm not a pessimist, but a realist when it comes to technologies that deceive us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So there we've had nuanced optimism, wild optimism, realism stroke pessimism, depending on your outlook. So Norman, what have you got for us?
I think I've got rational, realist, optimist.
That's what everyone thinks. Go on, off you go.
Well, thank you. I was considering some figures when preparing for this, and I looked at one example when if American farmers 100 years ago were told that agricultural employment would fall from 40% of all jobs to 2% as a result of productivity increases, what do you think the response would have been? It would have been one of fear, anger, etc. But if you think about this now, this is what's happened over the last 100 years. With a reduction of 95% in farm employment, America is able to feed 320 million people. Right? That is astonishing. And that's what we're talking about in terms of productivity, in terms of the output in production, wealth, etc. And so when we ask the question, could AI break the productivity impasse? And I have to say, I am optimistic. I am a firm believer in AI as a human achievement, as something that has yet to be refined as an adjunct to the ability for human beings to solve problems in the future. I think it has enormous potential. To put my position bluntly, I think AI will do little to solve the productivity impasse, because we have to understand what that impasse is, and therefore what AI can and cannot do in and of itself, it is no solution at all. First point to make is that AI is still, I would argue, in the stage of invention. The applications that can be built on top of these foundational models, I think we have no idea yet as to what we could actually come up with in the future. It's like trying to imagine when William Drake drove the first oil rig in 1865 in Pennsylvania, trying to imagine from that point onwards what the impact of that would be on the economy, on society, because that drove the petrochemical industry, which has given us so many of the modern things, including the motor car, the mechanization of society, the production lines. All those things were a result of that particular day when he drilled oil for the first time. Unimaginable that you could have understood that this is where things were going in the future. I think AI is in a similar place. And the idea that we can apply that in the way that we are now is really an expression of how low regard we have, how lack of imagination there is in this discussion. And this actually relates to my second point, which is that the productivity impasse is not a technical problem, simply a technical problem. It's not just simply a problem of lack of investment. There's much more fundamental things at stake here, and what's driving, what has driven the impasse that we just don't seem to be able to get out of, despite all these new inventions, technology, the ICT revolution, digitization, etc. How is it that we still have sluggish productivity, not just in Britain, but across the world, even in America, particularly in America? And I think and there's one book I would highly recommend you should read, and that's Phil Mullen's Creative Destruction. Because if you read that book, what Phil outlines is he explains how it is that we live in a society where we are risk averse, that the state has become the institution through which we try and preserve what exists rather than allow the spontaneous mechanisms of capitalism to destroy businesses that are unproductive, allow them to go out, lose those jobs, but invest in those areas where there are possibilities of change, of new technologies that can improve productivity. And this is really the point that, nobody's really looking at this. They're looking at this like a technical, as if there's a technical solution to this. This is a cultural, political moment where the people that run society themselves have lost faith in their own system, that they no longer are allowed the spontaneous laws, the mechanisms that capitalism has used to rejuvenate itself through crises, etc. Instead, we've had the state propping up businesses and big corporations. We've had, and as a consequence, and things just remain as they are. It's not that the state has become conservative. It's a conservator state. That is really how I would define the role of the state today, regardless of whoever's in power. That seems to be the role that even if you go back to Reagan and Thatcher, who was going to roll back the state, actually the state increased its involvement in the economy in those years, not decreased it. And so it's become the prop on which everything rests. Now, the problem is that when you try and introduce something like AI into that kind of environment, two things happen. One, we get the kind of bullshit that Andrew was just talking about, and the hype and everything about this. And I have to say, to some extent, Donald, this kind of really over-optimistic, this starry-eyed looking at some of the impacts that it has. Yes, AI can have these impacts, but the real question is, how is AI going to be diffused across the economy? It's not enough that we have DeepMind or doing some amazing research. I think the protein thing is absolutely incredible. But what about the small and medium-sized companies? When are they going to be able to use AI? Now, think about this, and I'm going to leave you on this. There are many barriers to AI being diffused in society today. There's the technical barriers of, for example, energy. Give you one example. America is going to need 50 gigawatts of additional energy to keep up the data center capacity that it requires by the end of the decade, which is going to mean an investment of $500 billion in data centers. The International Energy Agency forecasts that the growing use of AI could add to global electricity demand the equivalent of Sweden or Germany's annual consumption by 2026. think about that for a minute. Here we are in Europe, and everyone's going on about the Green Deal, and we're cutting back on energy, and we're not using atomic energy. There's not going to be energy that's going to fuel the data centers that will enable the AI companies to be able to provide this as a service financially to the rest of the economy, where the people will be able to buy this as a service, where you'll be able to access ChatGPT, but for numerous different tasks in the future. So there's a real problem there. And the final problem is regulation. We are regulating foundational models before we even know what they're going to be able to do. If you look at the EU's Artificial Intelligence Act, it has already ring-fenced areas that cannot be touched, but because it might produce harm. So what I'm actually saying is that AI's potential, because of this cultural moment that we're in, this risk aversion, AI potential is already being held back. So the real potential that we know that this could possibly bring in the future is actually now being hampered by this consciousness that in fact is really the mainstay of why we have a productivity impasse in the first place. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Norman. So we have plenty to discuss here. I've already identified that there are different types of AI, and that we've got the generative AI, which most of the hype is about, but also other kinds that do amazing things. There's the sociological factors. There's the unforeseen solutions as well as unforeseen problems. And there's the idea that it's not a technical problem at all. It's entirely a cultural and political problem, and that indeed those problems would hamper AI as much as anything else. Great. So I'm going to, as usual, take a few points and then come back to the panel a couple of times. That hand went straight up right there on the aisle, so we'll go there first.
I just want to say I sometimes worry that the conversation about productivity gets stuck in a bit of a definitional issue, where I think that a lot of people's conception of productivity is more output per input, and that's the kind of the natural and very kind of intuitive sense of productivity. But economically speaking, when we're talking about productivity, we're talking about, on a national level at least, value per hour worked by a given employee. And these two things are quite separate in practice. So I, for example, can see lots of situations where ChatGPT will increase the amount that an individual can achieve within a given space of time. That's productivity. I think the big question is transferring that into an economic sense. Is that making more money per man hour in a workplace environment? And I think especially considering that everybody is going to have access to this technology at the same time, I think the relative productivity gains in terms of profitability are probably likely to be a lot less. Insofar as AI is going to be able to be used to innovate in actual production technology, the development of new services and new real use values, which are going to be utilized within society at large, it will definitely be able to increase productivity, it will increase new markets, and it will increase the amount which people are able to buy with a given sum of currency. But I think there's another question, and just to illustrate the sort of the dichotomy with regards to productivity, my cousin used to be a Forex trader, and he once described to me his day at work, which was he turned up in the morning with a pot of money, he buy low, sell high, buy low, sell high, buy low, sell high, buy low, sell high all day. And at the end of the day, the pot was bigger, often by millions of pounds than it had been in the morning. He's done nothing, but he's one of the most productive workers in the country. So I think that there's a question here about the economic definitions which we're using around productivity and how that actually contrasts with people's actual intuitive, understood comprehension of productivity.
In the Nobel Prize Awards this year, two of the awards in physics and in chemistry went to researchers whose innovations were, I think, explicitly and heavily dependent on AI. Now, I don't know whether anybody noticed that the economics prize was given to three people, Darren Acemoglu and two of his collaborators. I put it that way deliberately, who, although in the citation, I don't think AI was mentioned, they have done extensive work on the effects of AI. I was just wondering, first of all, whether any members of the panel were familiar with Acemoglu's work and would like to comment on it. I think it's fair to say that Acemoglu is, on the whole, he's not a techno-optimist. He is, I think, somewhat skeptical about the effects of AI. He says if it's used correctly, if it's used the right way, it has enormous potential. But if I could mention one or two of the points he makes, although AI can bring about massive productivity increases in certain areas, as we've had documented. A lot of tasks which we want doing, it's very difficult for AI to replicate. I could give you an example, a telephone helpline. When I call up to raise some sort of issue with a company, I much prefer to talk to a human being. Whatever it is, the chatbots or whatever the alternatives, I found them absolutely useless. So can I ask, how long will it be before customer helplines, automated customer helplines, give as good a service as a human being would? That's one thing. But I think Acemoglu does, whatever you think of his work, does raise some legitimate concerns. He points out that there's a certain company which we are all familiar with. There are horror stories about the way it uses technology to monitor and control its employees. And there are also certain countries out there who use AI extensively to monitor and control their citizens. So AI can be used for good, it can be used for harm. What can we do, finally, to make sure it's used for good rather than for harm?
Good afternoon. I'll give you a little side now. I lost my father to Parkinson's disease, and I lost my mother to dementia. And my mother did, it sort of dragged on for quite a few years. So a little side now. I started off in manufacturing back in the 1970s. It's a large sort of labour force on the tools and such like. And of course, time has now moved on. Now you've got AI into the actual picture, and everything seems to be snowboarding. Those things that get discussed regarding end of life, like Esther Ransom bill going through Parliament, could it get down to a stage of the actual human being is not economically viable anymore due to costings, and we could end up in the Logan's Run approach we use in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for that very dark picture of devaluing human life. Yes.
What does the panel think? There are different forms of AI and all that kind of thing. There's mostly lots of doctorates and PhDs sitting in university libraries. There's in the past there's been talk of having a sovereign wealth fund. Shouldn't the government sort of capitalize it on all the intellectual capital and create some kind of sort of machine learning model based on all the theories that are in different PhDs and sort of use that to generate productivity improvements? It seems to be quite dystopic what's talked about here. Can we use AI to actually increase our country's capital? That's my point.
I like the radicalness of that. We've got all this knowledge sitting there, nobody reads it. Make a machine to read it and aggregate it. That really appeals to me, actually.
I'm 15 and halfway through my GCC course at the moment. Thank you. And
they clapped just for that.
And I'm trying to decide what I want to do in the future. And so, on a more of a personal question note, what jobs do you guys think won't exist in the future due to AI? What jobs might exist that don't exist now? And what jobs do you think won't really have been impacted by AI?
Thank you for using what's apparently a personal question to ask what's actually a very good, wide, general question of general interest. You should all watch and learn from that technique.
Thank you. I'm with the optimists because I started work at IBM in the 80s when we still had a typing pool, and I was working as an economist and I had to get someone to type something up. And this was the head of the typing pool, and she was so enthusiastic about the new machine she was typing on because it could remember a whole line of what she'd written, and she didn't have to use TypeX anymore. What I'd given her to type up was basically her demise and all of her co-workers, but anyhow, they all found other jobs. You never saw hundreds of women marching through the centre of Westminster demanding that we get rid of word processors and they go back to typing pools. So I know that we will survive. But we do have, unfortunately, the other side of the table is more convincing. Sorry. We have an energy problem and we have a regulation problem where now, even though 40% of the population worked in agriculture and that's gone down to 2%, if we continue with our green revolution, I suspect that's going to creep back up again because we're not going to be able to use the mass agricultural systems we've been using. But on the will we run out of energy, did anyone on the panel notice that in early September, I think it was the 4th, the government published a press release that was not mentioned in the press that data centres are now critical infrastructure in the UK. So we will run out of energy, but you won't get to turn off the data centre. So that's something that, did anyone notice that? And how are we going to cope when they get the energy and we don't?
Let's do the same order as we start with this time, then I'll mix it up next time. So, as always, don't feel you have to answer everything. In fact, please don't answer everything. Pick the things that you think you have something most useful to say on.
Indeed. And some great comments. By the way, just to be clear, the reason why I was applauding the 15-year-old is because my 15-year-old came here 4 years ago. Now he's speaking on a panel next. So I think it's just good, not least, to bring down the average age. The average age of...
okay, so in 4 years you've got to speak on a panel, all right? Life goals.
Yeah.
Okay,
There you go.
carry on.
No, I want to see him on a panel next year. Coming back to Ashimoglu, I mean, if you haven't read his book, Power and Progress, I think it's a co-written book, actually, 1,000 Years of Progress. I mean, where I really kind of disagree with him is, he's basically, I paraphrase, saying that this technology revolution is producing too many what he calls so-so jobs, or what David McGrath called bullshit jobs, or what we just would generally call shitty jobs. And there are two, let's be clear, there's far too many shit jobs in our economy. And actually, if AI and technology could help make those jobs more interesting, or even, frankly, completely obliterate those jobs, then that shouldn't necessarily be seen as a bad thing. I think where I disagree with economists like Ashimoglu, and I would put him in, the technology pessimist camp, is I think he's slightly kind of misreading that part of the challenge, I think, around modern society and the way we are and the way we feel isn't just about productivity and jobs. It's about what Thomas Piketty was talking about a few years ago, that the return on capital and assets is much higher than the return on labour and income. So when we talk about the productivity puzzle and the productivity problem, I think we've as much got to look into the issue of why, even for the labour that we've got around, it's not being rewarded as much as it was 30 or 40 years ago. And I don't think Ashimoglu even deals with that debate or even tries to answer that. In the same way, arguably, some of the critics of Piketty and his thesis, he doesn't really give a theory of, arguably at least Adam Smith and Marx did, a theory of how the economy either works or how the economy should work. And this is one of the challenges I think we've got of some of our Nobel Prize-winning economists. Many of them no longer have they don't have a theory of the economy and theory of society the way that our 19th and 20th century economists did, which is, I think, one of the reasons why, of course, in those days it used to be called moral philosophy or political economy. There was a sort of sense of a holistic view of society and how do we create societies that are well-functioning for everybody.
Excellent, thank you. Donald.
Yeah, I'd like to something came up here, the energy issue. I just happened to have written a big piece on that recently and did quite a bit of research on it. What's interesting here is that it's not an energy problem, it's an emissions problem. That's what climate change is around, okay? Now, it's a problem if there's not enough energy after we electrify. But a couple of very interesting things happened just over the last few weeks, in fact. So Google have commissioned 6 to 7 small modular nuclear reactors from a company called Kairos, who are an American company. Amazon announced yesterday they're doing the same. What's happening is that AI, curiously, is accelerating innovation on the nuclear front, which I'm a big fan of. I'm tired of governments ignoring, especially green parties, ignoring nuclear as an option when it's absolutely emission-free. Now, an interesting thing in the World Energy Report that was published, which sparked my research in this area, crypto uses far more energy than AI, almost double. Nobody's in the room crying out to ban crypto. AI at least has social goods that I've outlined here. Crypto is nothing but greed, speculation, fraud. So I think we should pick our targets carefully here. I think the energy problem will be solved. There's another thing happening in AI in the inside, which is the massive optimization of the use of energy. So DeepMind here, for example, reduced the data energy requirements on the Google's data centers. DeepMind is the beating heart of Google now, based in King's Cross, by 30%. So AI is, in a sense, helping to solve the problem as well. I think AI will, funnily enough, accelerate innovation on emission-free energy. The second question is to the young man here. I had 2 sons, and they're 30 now, but I remember them leaving school, well, when we were at school, asking me this question. Well, they didn't really, because I'm the dad, they were not. It's like sneering animal. But I did give them advice, and I'm glad I did, because they didn't become lawyers or doctors. And my advice was, don't become a professional. Don't commit yourself at 18 to a path you cannot escape from. And it was to do with a whole lot of work I'd done in medical education in Scotland, where the worst doctors are the sons and daughters of doctors, because they get trapped in something they never wanted to do. My advice to you, honestly, would be stay neutral for as long as you can, gather really good educational skills, and make a choice. Out of interest, one of my sons left school at 18, started a business, employs graduates. Don't think that university is the necessary route to success. I think that's a bit of a busted flush, to be honest, as you could see, if you read the data on that one. But secondly, if you do want to pick a degree, though, my other son did a degree in AI. His quid's in. So you could say there's some professions you're going to be pretty safe on, and I think, well, you haven't seen it.
Okay, I think the energy one is interesting. I think, not to put words in your mouth, Norman, but I think maybe the argument over this side of the table was that the lack of energy supply will hold back the innovation that could actually make a difference, rather than that energy is anyway. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Anyway, but I also think it's very interesting that although AI may not be in the short term revolutionizing innovation, in fact, in terms of push starting the use of nuclear power, which in my view is long overdue, then it might actually have an impact, which would be kind of ironic. Anyway, so just jumping in, misusing my chair's privilege there. Andrew, go on.
No, that's great. I've also followed the Google and Microsoft investing in nuclear or wanting to invest in nuclear. In fact, all the AI companies have committed to $1 trillion in spending. I wouldn't put too many hopes on that, given the current business case, the current reaction of business. People who pay money for it. It's much more like we're at the stage where that cartoon character has gone off the cliff and his legs are still cycling and he hasn't hit the ground yet. I'd love to have nuclear power. I'm not going to put my hopes on any of the AI generating nuclear power for us, nor should we. Teesside has got permission to build 4 small reactors, partly in the expectation that regional pricing will allow it to offer industry much lower prices than we're paying here or the rest of the country is paying. That's brilliant. We should be encouraging. Somehow it got that past the Treasury, which hates nuclear, and has allowed Ed Miliband to kill it this month. But anyway, back to the point. Darren Acemoglu, yes, his contribution for Goldman Sachs in July was really the moment when I think at board level they could say, you know what, this is a bit shit. His view, and I think he's a little bit optimistic, and I'll explain why, is that just 4.6% of tasks can be reliably automated. Now, the reliable is critical here. As I say, I have it running alongside me all the time. For Monday's column, I had to read 3 or 4 long reports. It was better to do it myself. These are government reports on a particular sector, minerals, critical minerals, than it was to allow Notebook LM, which I like, to do it for me. There's so much you get from peripheral vision. There's so much you get from doing it yourself. Didn't take any longer. I haven't saved anything from using Notebook LM. But Acemoglu's, where he is optimistic, is in coding. Now, coding is turning out to be a complete nightmare when you put ChatGPT in there. In fact, one of my favourite hacks is there's data spillage everywhere. What chatbots have done, we've learnt over the last year, is they've completely dissolved these boundaries that organisations need. Data needs to be over here, and these people need to see it. Here's some stuff that we can put outside the firewall. It's completely dissolved now because you can be outside the firm and you can ask something and it will tell you something extremely private from within that organization. There's some brilliant demos at Black Hat on this, but it can also impersonate any document that the organization has generated for internal use. And again, there are more brilliant hacks. This is a complete security nightmare. Coders tell me that when they generate code, like thousands of lines are pulled out in a second, you can't maintain it. All you can do is keep pressing that button and it will generate more code and nobody can read it. And there are some very clever security hacks actually to take advantage of that. So Asimoglu his contribution was important, I think, this year, because it's sort of a lot of the scales fell from people's eyes. There is so much peer pressure on this. A lot of directors only get their news from The Economist, the Tony Blair Institute, the big four consulting companies. And that's not the real picture. And they kind of keep spinning this thing, keep your eyes on the horizon, how great it will be. But what the firms inside tell us, in fact, what one director of a FTSE 100 company told me, we know what AI is. We've been using machine learning for years. We have to say a certain amount or our share price will go down. And that's the real sign we're in a bubble.
Okay, thank you. Sobering stuff. Norman, what would you like to pick up on?
Well,
Feel free to offer
young
another
man,
opinion on the...
young man,
Good, excellent.
read the classics, learn to think. I think that's my only advice, because what we will need in the future are people that can think, that can help these machines realize their potential. Because AI, for all its hype on LLMs, etc., they cannot think. They've got no self-awareness, no consciousness. They've got no will. They've got nothing. They don't understand any of the things they're putting out. They're just predictive text. And so the human capital is going to become more important, not less important in the future. I just wanted to point out it just struck me in the course of this discussion, actually. When you look at what's happening with big tech today, the trillions that they have, the biggest companies in the world now. What's happening, it seems to me, is that on the one hand, they're commissioning their own energy sources, as you say. Microsoft just done this deal to reopen 3 Mile Island power station. Now, whether this actually happens or not is yet to be seen, but they do seem to be committing billions of dollars to doing this. At the same time, companies like Microsoft, Amazon, they're developing their own chips, their own chipsets. Now, to create the chips that we need for AI, today, in the past, to have set up a chip factory would have cost maybe $3 billion. Today, to manufacture those kinds of chips, it's like $20 billion. Now, these companies are doing this themselves. They are now starting to invest in their own chip making to guarantee the supply of these things. Besides the security, national security dimensions of all of this, what seems to be happening is that these companies, sitting on all this money, which they could be investing in much more in terms of R&D and scientific development and all of that, they're sitting on this cash cow, and they're actually replicating a division of labor that in the past was a social division of labor. It's almost as that this is now happening within one firm. Now that, I think, has got enormous implications for the future, which we haven't even thought about. And that's really my key point, is that all these things, we know in all revolutions with technology, there are unexpected and unintended consequences, some good, some bad. Most of the time they're good because they do lead to new things that people have not thought about before. What I think we've got a failure of, what we've really got a shortage of, is human imagination and ambition. Because what we've been talking about in terms of the jobs that people are talking, all we're doing is we're projecting the existing job market into the future. We're saying, what could we automate or what couldn't be automated? Whereas, in fact, in the future, those jobs, we can't even think of them yet. We cannot conceive of the kinds of jobs they're going to be in the future. And that's where I think we need to be thinking a lot more, rather than just either pessimistically or over-optimistically trying to project these things into the future as if the future is going to be as what we've got today.
I'm just going to come back out, and then I will come back at the end and give the panel a few minutes to answer. My only addition to what job to get is learn to plumb. We're always going to need plumbers, and we're always going to need electricity. Learn to be an electrician. That's the one thing that's constant in all this discussion. So that's just a practical tip. Okay, so somebody there I think has the mic. Oh yes, start with you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, should you stand up for the camera?
All right. Yeah.
That's
Ewan
All
Grant,
on YouTube.
UK Defence Forum. I once worked for some abominable European Commission programs in Ukraine. I worked with the successor agency to the KGB. So I'm very interested in the real AI lessons of an article in the Times this morning about the drone war, which is very much a computer software and hence AI. Continuous campaign. My question for you all, and you've all touched on it, is what has surprised you so far? What hasn't?
There's no doubt that AI can produce improvements. If you are a radiographer and you're trying to sort through 10,000 x-rays, AI can help you do that very much faster. But I'm bound to say that Norman Lewis has, I think, along with Andrew Orlowski, captured the right aspects, which is that we're not only dealing with a share price ramp, especially in the case of NVIDIA, but we also have to recognize who creates AI? Human beings. What is the morale of those human beings at the moment? Low, even in AI and with the payoffs they're getting. If you go back to the Second World War, the Spitfire was produced 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 5 or 6 years across 24 marks, and they produced 10,000 copies. Why was that possible? Because the morale and the vision and the mission of society then was clear, and we wanted a forward movement against Nazism. Do we have that kind of feeling today? No, on the contrary. We have a feeling where humankind is useless. AI and disinformation, misinformation are the big dangers facing us all, so it must be restricted. And it won't be long before it's restricted in healthcare because of all the dangers that will come there. I'm just going to wind up and just say, one of the things that gives me pause about AI is Tony Blair and William Hague writing about it in the Times. I've got a picture, I can show it to people, of Tony Blair saying, no, he knows nothing about computing, and he's keyboard working with Hunt and Peck and 2 fingers. So it's much easier to turn a human being into a robot, like Tony Blair, than it is to make a robot emulate a human being. And it's time we remember that and try to get behind a forward movement of society that defends Western civilization. It's not about optimism and pessimism, it's about morale, ingenuity, and human capabilities, not large language models, data, and all of that stuff. It won't do.
Thank you. Definitely will need to give us the entire manifesto, but lots of interesting stuff in that. Okay, so if you'd like to go.
I thought, what would I use AI for? And what I really need is a PA. The reason is I get so many emails. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I thought, what do I need AI for? And I thought, well, probably the first thing would be a PA. If you could actually go through my emails, to which ones I really want to read, which ones are advertised in meetings I've already applied for, etc., etc., etc. Now, my questions are: one, is such a thing feasible, given that the administrator who works for the charity I'm a trustee of would be really good, actually a very intelligent human being with a master's degree? Will AI be able to replicate that? Two, will I end up trusting AI? If AI does something wrong, if it doesn't file company's return a company's house and I get a fine, will I lose trust? That could happen, and will trust be an issue? And the third thing is, what I'm really saying is, I get so much marketing rubbish in my emails. I want you to filter that. Now, what happens if the person sending it out has artificial intelligence, whose job is to get their marketing stuff through my my AI? We have to have a battle, and what would happen then?
3 very good points, and I obviously clearly need an AI PA to get me to the right room on time.
I want to take it back to the productivity paradox, and the people are throwing around Nobel Prize winners, to remind us that Robert Solow's comment from 1987 I think is still extremely relevant, which is that you can see the computer age everywhere except in the statistics. And for me, the statistics are output per working hour, as you say. Not very complex to define it, as you say, Charlie. So why is that not happening? Why do we see all this great technological advance, and yet the productivity figures, which aren't just a technical thing, as we I think agree, it's about how our wealth is created and how our living standards improve and how our wages improve. You can't do any of that without productivity. And I think Tom's historical sort of perspective on this, I think, is very valuable, because if you look back roughly last 250 years, right, there's always been, with technological advance, there's always been hype and there's always been anxiety. And generally what's worked out through that, and I think Norman's sort of agriculture example validates that too, is that when you go through that period of the hype and anxiety, it works itself out generally because you've had two things happening. Improving productivity, so wages have tended to increase, and you have better jobs being created because that's one of the consequences of the wealth creation. I think that has fundamentally changed since about the 1980s. I think that's the difference, because I think since then we've still had inventions, we've still had things being developed and very exciting technologies developed, but what we haven't had is the translation of that into productivity growth and therefore higher wages and into decent jobs. And that is why we have all these so-so or bullshit or administrative, bureaucratic compliance jobs. People are in work, but they're not productive work. And I think the reason for the difference, and there's one which, you can explain it, I think, by what I call the 3 I's. You can have a lot of invention going on, and there is still a lot more invention, so you've had that fairly constant for the last 250 years. Today it simply takes the form of AI or a lot of ground AI. You have innovation, which is turning that invention into something which is a working, implementable process, something which could potentially raise productivity. And the third I is investment. And that's the thing that we're missing. So it's a matter, because unless you diffuse those innovations across the whole of society, don't just leave them to Microsoft and Facebook and a few top companies who are putting a lot of money into this, but unless it diffuses across the whole economy, big companies, small companies, medium-sized companies, then it doesn't translate into productivity growth. So it's not a matter of the character of the latest various things that we are anxious and hyped about. That just happens to be where we are in history. It happens to be AI and large language models and robotics and so on. It's to understand why over the last 40 years there hasn't been that same dynamic of turning inventions not just into innovations, but into diffused, changing ways of practice across business. So it's what are the barriers to investment, not what are the barriers to the invention.
Thank you. That, by the way, is Phil Mullen, who wrote the book Creative Destruction that was recommended earlier.
Oh, thanks. Does Moore's law, like the doubling of computer power every 18 months, does that apply to AI in some way? Will AI make human IQ redundant? Learning facts and figures at school like 1066, Battle of Hastings, that's irrelevant now because you can look it up on your phone. Will this make human IQ, actual basic intelligence, completely redundant? Will there be a first-to-market advantage for the first company to make an AI robot that can just copy a task, and then they'll have like a monopoly? Visa and MasterCard have a monopoly on credit cards. NCR, the cash machine company, have a monopoly on self-service tills. They were the first to market advantage. So is it like with robots, will that be like the company that creates that robot can do any job, they'll get all the gold? Question about the Amazon code quickly. Is Amazon getting AI to write all of its code, or is it just checking for bugs? And lastly, there is regulation already. I use Grok AI, which I discovered recently on Twitter. Create an image of Donald Trump having a party on Epstein's Island. It wouldn't let me do that. So, thank you.
I just wanted to say one of the uses of AI that I don't think has been mentioned in a domestic setting for productivity is helping people do their jobs properly. So I was trying to get my daughter who's special needs into a special needs school. They've just said no, as they usually do. I've got no space as their stock answer. And I got GPT chat to comprise me a letter and then go through all the laws from the local authority. And I'll just say, Mum won, Council nil. He did wait a year, but she eventually got in. And I don't think people realise how good AI can help you in your personal life. When people say no, or people are trying to basically have your trousers down, you can really hold people to task, because this sort of default position a lot of people in councils and institutions is just to say no. But when you challenge them, a lot of people don't even know the law themselves. And when you can use AI to really challenge people and make them do their job properly, instead of sitting around looking at ASOS on a computer.
Okay. I'm picking up on Phil Mullen's point about Robert Solov. It's very interesting to look at the way that ICT, to put AI in a more general context, has been used. I was involved in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s in the revolution in publishing, where we took an industry which is 500 years old and was using hot metal and pressing it onto paper with ink and offset lithography, and we digitized the whole industry, which laid the basis for the web, as it happens. And I think the increase in productivity and profitability in magazine, newspaper, book publishing that we created was 20 or 30 times over 10 years, which is an incredible amount of productivity. And it's very difficult to see many industries where, in the UK at least, where we could increase productivity at that level. Well, I think Donald gave some interesting examples of, early mechanization and so on. And I wonder if someone asked a question earlier on in the festival about, look at the incentives and I'll tell you what the outcome is. Now, what's the incentive for companies and organizations to increase productivity using AI or otherwise? If it's in the public sector, and Andrew's written a lot about this, white collar and so on, organizations which are largely unaccountable, which have found a way to kind of surf across society as a kind of rent-seeking operation in a way, or private companies which are increasingly not beset by competition, whose relationship is mainly with government and other non-consumer actors, and who are able to, again, rent-seek and create income, profit, and so on in other ways than being more productive. So I wonder, who cares about productivity? I mean, we do, but which organizations are incentivized to actually implement productivity?
In the 1990s, there was this major productivity debate in the Clinton administration between various officials about whether or not the internet was going to lead to, was really going to make there be enough growth such that it wouldn't lead to more inflation. Now, at the time, this was a big mystery, and there was a huge body of work devoted into this and thing. But in retrospect, a lot of people said, well, the reason there wasn't inflation was actually due to globalization, that you got costs down via exports, via that. During the 1990s, you got a lot more people into the global economy with the introduction of China. My question is, because now there may or may not be a tendency towards deglobalization. I think this tendency is already afoot. Will this basically offset any sort of gains that are generated through AI, or will that lead to jobs elsewhere in industries if we'll sort of be forced to use it again?
And on the productivity question, I think the problem with productivity, there seems to be the very productive people not quite being able to get 20% more productivity happen a day. And it's all the people sitting around who aren't interested in producing anything at all. And I can see how, for the productive people, having an assistant that can speed up tasks is going to be very useful. But it's not solving the fundamental cultural issues around layabouts, basically.
Thank you. Well, as a professional programmer for over 7 years, I'd like to push back on the case of AI not making code bases less maintainable. I'd argue they make them more maintainable because you can write tests more quickly and easier. But my main question was, I wanted to invite Andrew to talk about mad cow disease and the poisoning of the internet well. There's a paper which has shown that LLMs which are trained on their own output perform worse and kind of gradually degrade, and Andrew refers to this as going a bit mad like a cow. But Anthropic, who have been purchased by Amazon, they use generated data to train their model and are widely successful and being used by companies, etc. So how do you square that peg, square that hole? if people are training models on generated data,
If it's been fixed, we can all go home. Hurrah!
if you can train models on generated data, then why are we going to get mad cow disease? And when can we expect the world to be poisoned? I've very heavily invested in this ChatGPT thing. I'd like a date to get out. Thanks very much.
Literally, you have 2 minutes, but I'm not going to jump out with a red card unless you'd really take the piss. Off you go.
Fine. 09 on the clock. Right. I started off obviously by saying why I'm a rational optimist, but actually I do want to perhaps... Can you hear me? Is it coming through? Good.
You really do have to kind of...
Yeah, you have to speak up a bit. Yeah, look, I started off in my 7 minutes talking about why I'm a rational optimist, but actually I want to perhaps finish with this just 1 minute and 20 seconds by just introducing some caution in the sense of talking about something that actually where my focus is. As I say, I'm not an AI expert. I write a lot about skills policy, and it's really just to make this point that we're not going to, I don't think, be able to meet the challenge of the future in AI, and obviously the dislocations that will cause, as every major economic transition going back centuries has done, unless we repair our education and our broken skills system, and in particular our broken labour market. Because actually, coming back to Phil's point about why have we seen so much stagnation in the last 40 years, I think in part it's about a Treasury orthodoxy, where really all they're interested in terms of their economic modelling, is growing the labour supply. That was obviously a big part of the freedom of movement agenda with the neoliberal EU. But what happens is when you prioritise that as a policy, growing labour supply, or you have stricter benefit regimes, which is about getting people into work instead of equipping people with the skills that can keep them in work, is that over time that leads to a situation where, you can throw bodies at a problem, and we have a lot of employers in this country who are not interested in innovation, they're not interested in technology. That's why we have in Britain car washes where, there's still manual car washes, often with people working illegally here and Albanian gangs that are operating them. What we're not doing as a country is having that discussion about how do we change the regulations. In my view, we should be banning, just like they do in France, those manual car washes. Why? Because it will result in a technology change where you want to get your car washed, you either do it yourself on a Sunday or get your son to do it for you. Or, you go and use the latest technology. So the point really I want to leave you with is that a big part of this challenge, yes, it's technological, but it's also about repairing a massively broken skill system and labour market that at the moment as it stands is not up to the challenge that we face here.
Thank you very much. Please hold your applause to the end. We'll applaud them all at once. Go on.
Yeah, one of the questions was what surprised you. Two things really surprised me. The speed that this thing get and how good it was, especially recent releases on the coding thing, I wholly agree with. But also the chain of reasoning stuff on 4.0. It just blew my mind how good that got so quickly. Coming back to the lady who mentioned her young children there, I did work on AI. You must remember that if you're blind or deaf, text-to-speech and speech-to-text, which exploded, this functionality in the 90s now, were all AI-based. Go and speak to somebody who's deaf or blind and ask them about AI. Their mobile phone is their remote control for life itself. It's also true now of dyslexia and other things. The massive opening up in terms of accessible education for kids. Believe me, SEND is not well covered in our educational system. But another thing I've been surprised that it's been such a provocation, because all I see is projects that I'm just working exclusively in the school. Just benefit, benefit, benefit. Good, good, good. I just finished a project with a young team, 3 people in the Netherlands, in a teaching hospital around surgical support. And, coming back to your point about optimism, their minds were blown. The enthusiasm, they were all in their 20s, was mind-blowing, as were the clinical staff in the hospital, and, of course, the patients, because less are going to die. So, I just see benefit after benefit in these projects, and I'm surprised at the venom, really, or the negativity, because I think we're skewing our views based on age and, to be honest, some confirmation bias and negativity that rightly Mullen said about all technology. I'm 67, I remember my local university used to take lots of graduates from in Sussex. There was a big petition from faculty to ban photocopiers because they thought it was the end of the book. I can remember all of these things, the internet, email, social media, computer games, every single one, this massive debate where the skew in the data and the evidence was unbelievable. Turns out, actually, it was all right, really. So, I would like to see us, Copernicus made us humble. We're just a little log. Darwin comes along, we're really just an animal. I think it's humbling us a little bit. That's why I disagree with this whole human exceptionalism thing. They all begin with C, creativity, critical thinking. Actually, it's humbled us as a species, but this is a chance for us to extend cognition, to do some wonderful things in the future, as opposed to just say, we're exceptional people and we're going to fight this to the death.
Thank you very much. Okay, Andrew, are we exceptional people?
That's I think we very much are. Jaron Lanier has this great quote in that for us to make the machines look smart, we have to make ourselves look stupid, and I think that's the best response to a statement like that at the end there. I want you to start with this point because I think it throws a lot of perspective on this, which is: are you familiar with how the term artificial intelligence was coined? Because I think that the original sin goes back to this moment. There was a McCarthy and von Neumann had this obscure journal. Let me take a step back. The software which is deterministic, 2 + 2 adds 4. If 2 + 2 doesn't add 4, then there's been a programmer error or a cosmic ray, very rare. But it will do what it says it does. And then there's another class of software which can be useful and interesting. It's goal-seeking. Herbert Simon wanted to call it heuristic software. So McCarthy and von Neumann were really struggling for funds, so they came up with this marketing term. McCarthy admitted it's a marketing term, artificial intelligence. Two big things wrong with that, artificial and intelligence. We've had various definitions. One, I think the gentleman said, what happens to IQ? Well, if your definition of IQ is you retrieve the number 1066 from a computer, that's not really intelligence. I think that the problem with artificial intelligence is if we just called it heuristic software, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I've got it running a lot of the time. It's just that we expect it. We've created a sort of mythical narrative for it. We've effectively created a secular myth. Help machines realise their potential, I think Norman said. Well, look, it's not a godlike thing. This is, again, a point of Lanier's. If we just call it a useful software that's wrong 20% of the time, we can all live with that. But I suspect we wouldn't be in this room talking about miracles of productivity if we were doing that. This is the age of the grifter and the bullshitter. And I think this is why, one of these things, there are a lot of people don't have a lot to do, that they're on LinkedIn, they go to TED Talks, and they need to be amongst this circle. AI is a very, very big deal. I'm just fascinated to see the reality pan out on the ground, where some people find it useful, that's okay, and lots of people are sort of going, well, what the hell is this? Why have we been led down this path? It's almost 70 years since that term was coined. It's been a lot of winters in that time. It has not actually once come up, and I suspect that's largely to do with our expectations of it, which make our own expectations of what human beings can do, our own imagination and creativity so low. Those words were actually Lighthill's when he killed AI in 1972 in a debate with McCarthy. I've a bit of time because I like the Lisp programming language, and I think McCarthy invented a lot of nice stuff. But he was the evangelist for that first era of symbolic AI. And Lighthill he ended the debate, one of these post-war great polymathic characters like Fred Hoyle. And he ended the debate, he goes, why do you keep doing this? Is it just men who want to give birth to something? Humans have incredible capabilities, and here you are sort of turning a machine into a magic creature.
Thank you very much. So Norman, you technically have like minus 15 seconds. So
right.
Take as long as you need, but make it as efficient as possible.
Okay. Well, I would want to just return everybody's attention to the serious question of the productivity impasse, because that's what we're not really talking about. We're talking about all these lovely technologies and what it might do and it could do this, and isn't it wonderful it's doing X? But there's a real basic problem here. The Financial Times last week had a report that indicated that the majority of large tech companies in the US themselves are growing slower than they were in the past, and that outside of the large tech ones, the smaller tech companies are actually shrinking. And outside of the tech sector, things are even worse. And we're not paying attention to that. We're kind of, we're just thinking, and this is the point to I think what Phil was pointing out, the investment question. Why are these companies not investing? They're sitting on trillions. What is going on here? There's a much deeper problem than we're crediting, and I think that's what we really do need to focus on. The final point I want to make about AI is that it is a human invention. And for all it might do in the future, it will be driven by human ingenuity and problem solving. And I thought the example that was given about the woman who got her child into a nursery using ChatGPT kind of illustrates to me exactly that point. When ChatGPT came out and everybody was talking about how wonderful it was and everything, no one imagined that somebody would use that to get it to write a letter so you could get a child into a nursery. That's the human ingenuity. And if you even step back even further, it's all the interaction that people are having with ChatGPT that's training ChatGPT. It's you. That's who's doing it. It's not a machine that's got this intelligence. It's you. This is a crowdsourcing on a scale that we've never seen in the past. So where that goes in the future, well, how much imagination have you got?
And on that optimistic note, thank you very much, the panel.